Welcome back and welcome if this is your first time here. Um, I've decided to do these talks every Wednesday at noon, and my plan is to give a little craft talk and then also to give a prompt. And I think today I'll start with a little story. And if you've read my latest post, you've probably read this story, but I'll just go ahead and share it anyway. I was driving over the weekend from Santa Fe back to Boulder, where my home is, and I was just north of Ponca Springs, and there's a sign there that I'm familiar with that says, um, "Watch for wildlife," and it's near South Park in Colorado, the real South Park, not the show, and which is a vast sort of flat valley, and it's full of wildlife, and it was early morning, it was dawn, it was before sunrise, and there was just a little bit of orange creeping up over the mountains to the east, and I saw that sign again, and I always get a little nervous when I'm driving through there that time of morning because of deer, essentially. And so, I was driving a little carefully and um, kind of ready to brake if I needed to. And as I'm driving, all of a sudden, this white shape emerges from the forest, and it just flies directly out horizontally and crashes into my windshield. And I recognized it in the final moments there as a dove. It was a white dove, and my heart sunk immediately, and just felt this feeling of guilt and you know this feeling of is there anything I could have done to avoid it? And of course there wasn't. And And I kept driving, and I also knew immediately this was a meaningful occurrence for me. Sad about the dove, and also alert and awake to what these symbols that come through our lives mean. And so I spent the next, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes driving and then pulled into a gas station. And I noticed as the sun was coming out that there was a dusty imprint of the shape of a dove on my windshield. And so I got out and almost didn't want to wash it off, but I did find a squeegee and started to clean the window, and it just wouldn't go away. There was just, it was really imprinted on there, and so I stopped and filled up my tank and kept going. And I think on Monday I just felt the need to write this story, and it's kind of what I do, and it's one of the things that Substack's been such a blessing for, is that we can write our stories and instantly publish them. I've been doing this a long time. I've been doing it 30 years, and in the old days, you'd have to pitch a magazine and, write the pitch version and maybe even send it in the US mail and then wait a few weeks to hear back about whether they wanted you to write the piece and publish it. And so now we have this instant access to do that. And of course there's, positives and negatives about all of that and about the loss of the old way of doing things, but it's really an amazing thing that we can do this and we can share our stories with each other so easily. Um, and it kind of, it got me thinking about why I love memoir writing and why I love helping people to write memoirs. And because there is this way that we can be in communion with each other when we write and share our writing. I was able to write that story, um, and just felt a lot of feelings about it, and just was both joyful and it was poignant to share it. And then I began to get some comments back about it, and people shared their reflections of that story and how it hit them, and maybe a story about a time that something similar happened. And it creates this community and a sense of belonging. And I believe that's even true in writing a book. When I wrote my memoir, Into the Soul of the World, and published it a couple of years ago, I was surprised that really one of the most meaningful, or maybe the most meaningful part of it, was getting, mail back from people who, were really touched by my story, and also by, maybe they found a little bit of a roadmap for their own journey out of whatever struggle, similar struggle they were going through. So, um, it's really an amazing art form, and I know some people malign it as self indulgent and uh, narcissistic or whatever. But I think it's actually the opposite of that. It's when we share our vulnerabilities and share our struggles, we actually are, being authentic and real and connected to our true self, and we actually create more belonging and community. Um, so I thought I'd talk a little bit now about how I approach teaching memoir and give a little craft lesson. I think if you talk to many editors and agents who work in memoir, that they'll say, or many of them will say, that the essence of a good memoir are there's two things, and it's great stories, and a strong voice. And so great stories strung together is one of the pillars of a memoir, and then a unique, strong voice. And I think of voice as so much more than just the words you use or the style you write in. Voice is really connected to your worldview. We get a peek in at how you see the world, and you know how you move through it, what you think about it, what you feel about it, any kind of philosophy you have about yourself and life. So so that's my focus when I teach, and I think that we all have, the brain is wired for story, and so we all have this innate superpower to tell stories. And yes, I teach craft, and we'll talk about that here in these sessions going forward. We'll talk about character development, and we'll talk about plotting and scene writing and adding action and all those sorts of things. They're important. It's important to storytelling, but I also kind of believe in honoring first, the our innate power of storytelling, and really try to help people to tap into that. I feel like there's almost a groove, or at least this is how I think about it. When you can tap into that storytelling groove in your mind, and lean into kind of this archetypal way that we make meaning of life through stories, then you can really write you write good memoir, and you can move people to feel and to think and to act. And so I thought next, I would talk a little bit about what makes for a good story. And probably a lot of you have taken craft lessons before, and the essence of an arc. But essentially, I think story comes down to three things. It comes down to desire. It's what you want to have happen. Then struggle, and then realization. And when you kind of pull those three things together, or you kind of imagine or think of these three things as you're telling a story, it can really, you know, bring more strength to your storytelling. So desire. When you begin a chapter, or when you begin an anecdote, or a scene, I think you really want to let the reader know and feel what it is you want to have happen as you face this next struggle in your life. Um, and the more desire you infuse it with, the more mystery you create, because then the reader needs to find out, what's on the other side. Did you get what you wanted or not? Or did you kind of get a mixed bag? And so desire is such an important thing to kind of infuse your writing with. And then the next thing is the struggle, and we need to write the struggle. And typically, we write it with what's called rising action. And something happened and causing something else to happen, or I did something causing something else to happen. And then I did something else related, and then something else happened. And eventually you kind of build toward a crisis and climax. And the way I think about that when I start out, is I try to feel what that crisis and climax is, and I try to write toward it. And that's kind of a subtle thing, but maybe you can kind of feel into what that would be like. If you can imagine what the high point, both in the world and the external world, as well as the internal high point that kind of accompanies that, and if you can kind of feel that in your body as you're writing and write toward that, I think it leads to better storytelling. And then, of course, after that climax is that resolution, and that resolution is when then you have the opportunity to reflect and to make meaning and to share the realization or the epiphany that you had on the other side. Um, and so that's the essence of a good story. And I think one of the things that I try to do as I tell a story is to make sure I'm checking in on my internal world as I'm moving through the external world. To every now and then, you know, fill the reader in on what's happening for me inside, both emotionally and maybe mentally, and in my heart. I think that, and it's also important then when we do that to embody these emotions, because, the reader doesn't get much when you just say, I was happy or sad or joyful or grief stricken. They need to see it, feel it in their bodies too, which means you've got to write about it in their bodies. Sometimes that means, locating a feeling in your body, and sometimes it means representing that feeling, with action, maybe, um, as you get more tense, your hands grip, or maybe, a tear does kind of form in your eye. But there's ways to represent our feelings in an embodied way. Um, so that the importance of kind of moving inward and outward. That's kind of how I think about it, as I'm telling that story. So, just to kind of wrap that up is, think about what your desire is, what you want to have happen at the beginning of a scene or a story. Really embody that struggle, both externally and internally, and then finding, some meaning on the other side of that struggle, and articulating that. And one way that I think about that reflection, or that articulation of the meaning, is to ask myself, how do I feel now about what happened then, and how do I think now about what happened then, and if I allow that, these questions to be answered, and to be answered imperfectly, and that's kind of an important thing to note, is that, the reader wants to see you working these problems out on the page. They don't need you to have, hard answers, and they definitely don't want pat answers. They want to see you, struggling. There's that word again, struggling with the meaning of something. Maybe you say, maybe it was this, maybe this was what it was about. And then maybe halfway through that, you reverse fields, and you say, no, that wasn't what it's about. I think now it's more about this. And if you keep all of that on the page, don't strike it out, at least not at first, in your first draft. I think you'll get, some really rich reflection and meaning created from it. And, for me, it's almost like that reflection stage is almost like jazz. It's like you're not trying to write, rigidly and importantly. You're trying to let it all come out, and see, reverse your thoughts and see what comes out, and that's an important, especially in that first draft, because it's so much easier, to draw a line through something that just felt a little too much, or, maybe you didn't want to go quite there. It's so much easier to do that in a second draft or revision than it is to try to create more of that. So that's my thoughts today. I do think stories are how we come together, and it's how we find meaning in our lives. It's how we find more community, and the more we share with each other in our physical lives, and the more we share with each other on the page, and in our newsletters, and any other places that we share, the the more community we have, and the more we share more deeply about ourselves too, which is, when we withhold parts of ourselves in our writing, I think people feel it, and they don't feel as connected to you. So, I'll pause there. I want to give you a prompt. And so the prompt is sort of based on this talk, and it's pretty simple. It's what have you struggled with recently? Just identify something you struggled with recently, and then, you know, try to consider, and as you write about that and tell the story of that struggle, try to, think about or embody to bring in the desire you had. What did you really want to have happen during that struggle? What was the outcome you really wanted and desired? And then allow us to see on the other side of that struggle, you know, where you landed, and did you get that? And that's that mystery and that suspense that all good stories have. So then the final part of the prompt then is to reflect and to tell us, how you feel and how you think about that struggle now that you've got some perspective and some 2020 hindsight about it. So that's the prompt I'd like you to work with. And I'll be back on Friday, and we'll do some writing together. And maybe that prompt is something that's going to yield a Substack piece for you, or some other piece of writing. And it's been a joy to be here. And these are proving to be a little shorter than I thought, but I just think this is a great format to share, and try to help people with memoir. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me through the app. And I hope you have a wonderful afternoon.